I'm just a businessman. I'm not a politician. I've never concerned myself very much with politics. You know, I've heard it often stated that this country is liable to blow up in your face at any minute. I think that's absolute nonsense. And I would say there are few countries that I've visited in recent years less likely to blow up in your face at any minute. And that by and large, most people in South Africa are pretty well contented.
We are going to use all forms necessary to get our freedom in South Africa, whether it is violence against those who are violent against us, whether it is any type of violence possible. Our aim is to get our freedom, and we are prepared to get our freedom at whatever sacrifice necessary.
We arrived in South Africa 3 centuries ago, more than 3 centuries ago. That was more or less the same time that the modern Americans arrived in America. Nobody has any difficulty in identifying America as a nation with a right to America. But the world seems to have a great difficulty in granting us the same right in Africa.
Where you do have the whites in control and then using their position really to deny African people certain rights, certain fundamental human rights, that tends to build amongst the Africans, I hope that will not be the case, but as frustration and to a certain extent hatred. I hope not, but there will be the tendency in that direction.
There is almost a virtual unanimity in the General Assembly that apartheid is something abominable, something abhorrent. One may have some differences about the words to use. Some might call it a crime against humanity. Others might call it an offense against human dignity. But there is this unanimity against apartheid. There is a unanimity that apartheid is dangerous to international peace and security.
I admit that sometimes the knowledge of South Africa in outside countries is badly based. But it seems to me that members of the human race are entitled to watch with critical appraisal what happens in other countries. If only the countries of Europe had taken Germany more seriously in the 1930s, we might have been spared many of the troubles that plague the world today.
The idea that one group of people is inherently superior and therefore chosen to rule over another group of people is not new. Today, however, almost everywhere in the world, discrimination on such grounds is either formally disowned or legally discouraged. South Africa is an exception. The policy of apartheid, literally separateness, has been elevated by the government of South Africa from a mere theory of racial superiority to the law of the land. As the late Prime Minister, Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, put it, we want to keep South Africa white. Keeping it white can mean only one thing, namely white domination. Not leadership, not guidance, but control, supremacy. The key to apartheid in South Africa is the passbook. Every African over 16 years of age must carry this document on his person at all times. Its stamped pages regulate every detail of his life. He is subject to arrest and criminal proceedings if he cannot produce it on demand, or if any part of it is not in order. Without it, he cannot hold a job or travel from one part of South Africa to another. To the blacks, it has become the odious symbol of the denial of every basic human right and freedom. Since 1948, the government of South Africa has passed hundreds of laws and thousands of regulations and proclamations concerning apartheid. They regulate the lives of more than 4/5 of the population of South Africa. That is to say, the 15 million non-whites. Yet this great majority of South Africans has had no voice in the making of these laws and no legal means to change them. In a society ruled by a white minority, The African has become a virtual alien in his own country. He cannot own property anywhere in South Africa. He is subject to search in his home and in the streets. In order to maintain a huge, cheap labor force, the government has decreed that he may not leave his hometown without permission, and once he has left, he may not return for more than 72 hours without the authorization of a labor official. Often, he cannot live with his own wife and children because they are employed in separate areas. He cannot mix with whites in any social situation. Intermarriage is strictly prohibited. Every aspect of his daily life, from restrooms to the education of his children to the cemetery where he is buried, is strictly segregated by skin color alone. He is denied, in short, every basic human right, including that of protest. Because he cannot by law live in the cities, huge townships of African workers have grown up on the outskirts of urban centers like Cape Town, Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Durban. Every morning, large numbers of African workers leave the townships to go to their jobs in the cities. Without this pool of cheap labor, the economy of South Africa could not survive. It is doing very well. South Africa boasts the best developed economy of any African state. Its growth rate is an impressive 8 to 9% yearly. South Africa remains the world's leading supplier of diamonds, gold, and platinum. It can maintain this position largely because of the low wages paid to African workers. The average African miner makes about $25 a month. A white miner about $375. They may work side by side, but the white man is always in charge. By law, skilled labor is reserved for the white worker. Yet no African is allowed to join a union or strike, no matter where he works or under what conditions. If he is absent from work without permission for only one day, he is subject not only to immediate dismissal, but also to criminal proceedings. South Africa's economy has been diversifying since the Second World War to the point where it is almost self-sustaining. But the gold from South Africa's mines still plays an important part in balancing the country's foreign trade. 90% of the miners in South Africa are Africans. Most of them are recruited in the rural areas and must leave their families behind. They work only as long as they are able-bodied. When they are no longer needed, or when they are too old to work, they may be declared redundant by a labor official and forced to leave town within 24 hours. Around the mines, the companies have built vast areas of workers' compounds like these. Here the men lead a regimented existence without women or children, very different from the way of life most of them are used to. The rooms are clean and comfortable, but not much more. To let off steam and fight the boredom of this bachelor life, many of the men participate in brutal, bare-fisted boxing matches. Often these are organized by the mine companies. During their off hours, they can also go to one of the government-provided open-air beer halls. The only thing served here is a thick, soupy beer of very low alcoholic content. It's made from corn and served in buckets. As a social life, it leaves much to be desired. Some of the men also find their way to back alley speakeasies called shebeens. Here, female companionship, as well as stronger alcoholic beverages, are available. So much for the life in the cities. Driving through the smaller towns of South Africa makes the difference in living conditions very obvious. The whites live better than people of equivalent income in Europe. Most of the Africans live in slums, no better and no worse than slums elsewhere in Africa. What does make a difference is that they live under the oppressive laws of apartheid. The staggering number of these laws and their complexity overwhelm even professional jurists. Anyone not trained in law cannot hope to understand even a small part of their often conflicting rulings. Yet every year more than 500,000 Africans pass through the prisons of South Africa. Thousands of opponents of apartheid, including many whites, have been jailed, banished, or banned. According to a working group of experts of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, South Africa has become one vast prison house for the opponents of apartheid. Many white South Africans justify the theories of apartheid by citing the supposedly low level of civilization among the Africans. Mr. Am is an orange farmer in the northern Transvaal.
In 1896, my father was a very old man and not too well. And he had 9 sons, and he said, before I die, I want to buy an orange farm for my sons. And he tracked up with a little vehicle, 4 horses, little wagonette, from Johannesburg, and came to this place, which is 180 miles from Johannesburg. And we settled here. When we came, the place was only inhabited with natives. And the men had a very pleasant life. They were dotted about at various points, and they used to spend their days in going from one beer drink to another. And the women had a rotten time. They were nothing more than beasts of burden. And we couldn't get these men to work. But today we have plenty of labor.
As in the cities, the labor force is almost entirely African. Many of the white farmers here in the Transvaal, 1,000 miles north of Cape Town, are descendants of the families who went north during the Great Trek of 1836. The first white men to settle in what is now South Africa were Dutchmen. They came in 1652 to set up a fort, a place to provision the ships rounding the Cape of Good Hope on their way to the riches of the East Indies. By 1806, when the British acquired the Cape, the first settlers had begun to spread from the coastal areas to the rich farmland of the interior. By then they had stopped thinking of themselves as Dutchmen living in Africa and began to talk of themselves as citizens of an Afrikaner nation. Mainly farmers, they were deeply attached to the land and to their Calvinist religion. They even evolved a language of their own, Afrikaans, a mixture of many languages but based principally on High Dutch. These stolid conservative farmers bitterly resented the newly arrived British and their commercial interests. So they packed their belongings into ox wagons and moved into the interior. In 1835, the Great Trek north had begun. On their way, they encountered African tribes who were pushing their way south. There were terrible, bloody clashes between the white settlers and these tribesmen. Not until late in the 19th century did the Afrikaners, together with the British, finally subdue all of them. The settlers, who called themselves Boers, a Dutch word meaning farmer, went ever further north. Isolated by their own choice and by geography from the revolutionary changes that swept Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, they held to their strict Calvinist Protestantism, which justified their strong feelings of racial superiority.
The Dutch Reformed Church believes in apartheid. Every nation has its own place in God's plan, according to the Bible. We believe that they must be evangelized, and everyone that is born again, he knows his place as a native or a Connaught. Get the native to believe in Jesus Christ, and you have met your problem halfway. Then he is obedient, trustworthy, and your real help and friend. And then he learns to love his master. The master again will be kind and appreciating if he knows the same Lord.
After the Second World War, when the Nationalist Party came to power and the policy of apartheid was articulated, there also began the virtual isolation of South Africa from the ideas that were beginning to sweep the former European colonies in the rest of Africa. The government literally shut the door on the suggestion that the non-white majority in South Africa had any right to determine its own future. Today, most of South Africa's farms are in the hands of white landowners. The land is bountiful. The main crops include fruits, sugar, and wool. Even with the great increase in industry and mining, 1/3 of South Africa's exports, excluding gold, are still agricultural. Of all the black South Africans in the country, more than 2/3 live in the rural areas. Those that work on the white-owned farms live in conditions that approach serfdom. The lucky ones find themselves working for benevolent but paternalistic masters. Wages, when there are any, are vastly lower than in the cities and towns. In some instances, the workers are given only food, clothing, and shelter. The countryside is often stunningly beautiful, and for the well-to-do white landowner, the life can be very pleasant. The climate is temperate, and there are servants aplenty. In the rural areas, just about the only contacts between whites and blacks are those between master and servant.
Well, I feel that really the issue in South Africa is essentially a moral issue. But, you know, it's very difficult to get people to face up to moral issues. And really our whole attitude towards the African people in this country, all the people of color, is basically, I think, a moral issue. We want to use them. We have an economy which depends on them. And yet, we don't want to treat them like human beings and give them those basic things in a society which make for happiness, which make for prosperity. We all know under other circumstances that if people live in slums and people don't have rights, if they don't have a good family life, a closely welded family, all able to live together, that you get crime, you get troubles of all kinds. But somehow in South Africa, we don't seem to realize this. And our African people who live in the urban areas live unnatural lives. People don't think of the problems of their servant, for example, who can't live with her husband because she's working for you in a house, her husband is somewhere else, she can't live with him. Her children are scattered. People don't think of this in terms of, it happened to me, how would I feel about it? And they tend to think of them as something different, just a group of people. And this is something which frightens me very much, because although many white South Africans don't realize it, this influences you as a person. And I think you become less human. You tend to slur over the moral issues and just live your comfortable life, because life is very comfortable in South Africa.
And so it appears to the casual visitor, the foreign tourist who sees South Africa only as a beautiful country with magnificent beaches, a booming economy, and the racial problem seemingly well in control. The tourist can afford to ignore the strong currents raging beneath the apparent tranquility. The white South African cannot.
And many South Africans, white South Africans, are unhappy at the apartheid policies which are being practiced in South Africa. and yet they see no real alternative to the practice of apartheid. They have, by and large, been conditioned to accept that if political control slips away from the white man into the hands of the black man in South Africa, then in fact there will be a period of oppression of the white man, and this will lead to both his economic and his political downfall.
In 1945, only 4 African countries were independent nations. But suddenly, after more than a century of colonialism, the map of Africa began to change dramatically. Over the next 19 years, 32 new countries achieved statehood in Africa alone. These new members of the United Nations soon began to make their voices heard in the General Assembly. Racial discrimination in South Africa became one of their prime concerns, and they mobilized world opinion.
I think you could divide the consideration of apartheid in the United Nations into 3 main stages. In 1946, it was brought up as a very limited item of complaint by the government of India against the government of South Africa on the discrimination against Indians alone. It developed in 1952 into the broader problem of racial discrimination and racial conflict or tension in South Africa. This went on till about 1960. I think you can describe this as a long phase of inquiry, of investigation, of fact-finding, and of judgment that apartheid is bad, and of appeals again and again to the South African government to change its policy. Then you have a second stage, I think a very brief stage of from about 1960 to 1962 or 63, when many things happened. On 21st of March 1960, you might remember, there was the incident in Sharpeville where something like 70 people were killed and 200 were injured in a demonstration. The people who were killed were peaceful demonstrators, unarmed, and almost without provocation, the police shot at them and killed them. This spread horror all over the world. For the first time, the United States government issued a statement deploring this situation. And then all the Asian African members of the United Nations brought the matter to the Security Council as a situation which was endangering the peace in South Africa and in wider areas. Then you have the last stage, I would say it goes on from 1962 or 63, where the United Nations has recognized that appeals alone are not enough. It has very definitely recognized that the South African situation is not only an unjust situation, but a situation which has the potential of international conflict, potential of disturbing and endangering international peace and security in very wide areas, with repercussions in Africa as well as in other parts of the world, and that more than appeals were necessary. The United Nations for many years has been trying to solve this problem by persuasion, by economic sanctions and the arms embargo which has been adopted by the Security Council. Since then, many countries have stopped supplying arms to South Africa. But this was not apparently adequate. The results were very little. The situation has got actually worse and worse year by year. And I think, I have a feeling that we might be entering a 4th stage because this last stage of a certain amount of pressures has not quite worked. And I see an implication in the recent debates and the recent resolutions that there is a feeling that any hopes of persuading South Africa to change its policy are unrealistic. Perhaps what is needed is more effective and more direct action by the United Nations to weaken the government of South Africa, because recognizing it is as the one which is following the wrong policy, and to provide very active support to the people in South Africa, to the majority of the people in South Africa, black, brown, and some whites who are against discrimination, to fight for the legitimate rights and for the principles of the Charter.
Today, what is happening outside South Africa is as important as what might be happening within South Africa itself. And therefore, what we are asking the world to do is not to solve our problems for us, but to assist us solve those problems. We have tried to ask that that assistance should be given in such a way that we can solve the problems peacefully. That has not been forthcoming. And we are continuing to try and solve the problems with the methods that are available to us. And the stage that has been reached is that the methods that are available to us now are those which we have tried to resist over a long period of time. They are the methods of violence. This is what we are facing and have decided to face. Because the worst of all horrors in the world is to live forever as a slave, as a hated, despised, subhuman. And this we reject.